When you think of English Puritan colonies in the Americas, I'm sure you think of things like Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, the Quakers, and all stuff New England, if you think about it at all. What most people don't think about is its short lived sister colony called Providence Island in the heart of the Caribbean. In fact, this colony was actually the favorite of the two, and most of the investment and national interest was directed there. New England was a cold corner of the world. Providence Island was a beautiful, fertile island in a great location, but it would survive for just over 10 years before being wiped out by a Spanish armada. And during that decade, it would devolve from the hope for England into a bitter nest of pirates, full of infighting and populated by angry planters, slaves, and pirates. Providence Island is a small volcanic island off the coast of Nicaragua. Its temperature averages in the 80s, has heavy rainfall in the autumn and dry summers. It has great conditions for growing crops and natural defenses like mountains and a harbor. Its location meant it would make a great base for privateers, which is the name of legal pirates who have been authorized by the king to only target hostile countries. The plantation's investors, who created the Providence Island Company, were afraid of the threat Catholic Spain posed to their religion. They saw a Puritan colony in the heart of the Caribbean as a great way to bring wealth to England and help revitalize their religious wars back in Europe. Hopes were very high for Providence at the outset. All the investors were rich and had experience overseeing previous colonies. The first governor, Philip Bell, was the previous governor of Bermuda, another successful English colony, and brought experienced settlers with him. Because of Providence's location, a Spanish attack was inevitable, so
Captain Axe
began the fortifications after he arrived with Bell. First building Warwick Fort, overlooking the harbor of New Westminster. While the Bermudans were busy setting up the colony, the Seaflower left London with the first 100 Puritan settlers. The investors believed their settlers would work harder than on any normal colony because they all had a common goal: creating a model religious society and helping save their religion. Because of this, they tried to keep as much of the population Puritan as they could. This meant things like slaves, professional soldiers, or settlers from other colonies were to be kept to a minimum. The most fought over issue throughout the colony's life was the military. As we talked about before, the island is surrounded by Spain, England's number one enemy. So from the time of the first settlers arriving, a robust military plan was set into motion. All settlers were expected to attend military training twice a week and be prepared at all times to drop whatever they were doing to fight off an invasion. The company asked settlers to set up their plantations near the forts so they could rush to their positions in the event of a surprise attack, promising to repay anyone who had to move on to less fertile soil as a result. Well, that's nice of them. I'm sure the company won't have any problems repaying their promises in the future. Another defense requirement was the constant presence of veteran soldiers and pirate captains hired from other Caribbean colonies. These guys were by far the most volatile element in the entire colony. As can be expected from veteran military captains, they constantly butted heads with the civilian government and the ministers for power. Making things worse, a lot of the most skilled veterans had famous ancestries and basically thought they were knights. Pirate knights. They prized public opinion higher than anything else, and used their social power to get favors back in London and live in relative luxury on the island. This military presence triggered the colonists so much because a lot of them came to Providence in the first place to escape the military obligations in England. England was just finishing a massive war against both Spain and France in the late 1620s when Providence Island was being founded. So many settlers had just lived through a period of massive military levies and taxes and were especially sensitive to it. These tensions would continue to build over the course of the decade, and the company will be forced to choose between the needs of the colonists and those of the captains. As 1631 went on, Providence Island was looking really good. There were no attacks, the forts were being finished, there were good harvests, and Governor Bell even wrote back to the company saying the island would be one of the gardens of the world. But after the first years, the wheels would start to come off. First with the investor-colonist relationship and the government. All successful English colonies during this time period had a similar system. People only emigrated to the risky colonies if they could have two things: land ownership and self-government. Settlers on Providence Island barely got either of these things. The island was small and the land was limited, so it was more difficult to promise everyone land, unlike in the almost endless territory of the continental US. As far as self-government goes, the company was against giving their colonists any control the entire time. The company micromanaged colonists on what crops to grow, where to set up their plantations, how much time to spend on public works, how many servants they could have and what they could work on, and what ships they could buy and sell from. Planters were only allowed to sell the company ships, for example, because the company took half of the profit from sold crops, but they couldn't get anything when colonists sold it under the table. You might have heard of indentured servitude from other English colonies before. It was basically the foundation of the entire system. Settlers would sign contracts with the company that they would emigrate to their colony in exchange for land for cultivation and enough servants to farm it. This was in a time before English colonies adopted wide-scale African slavery, so servants had to come from England. The way this worked is actually really interesting, so I'm going to talk about it for too long. So when you were 14 or 15 in England, you would leave home and go serve someone else under a 1-year contract. The person you served basically acted as your new father, and because this is the 17th century, they would force you to work on their land and could do things like beat you for slacking off. Servitude was a way to get the skills needed to eventually run your own farm before you were old enough to do so. When the year contract was over, a bunch of masters and servants would all go to a hiring fair to make new contracts. Servants would talk to each other and share stories about their masters to root out the bad ones. Being abusive to your servants would make it harder to get new ones. Servitude like this was always a phase of life for an English person. It was never permanent. They would serve different masters for up to 10 years or so until they had enough money and skills to start up their own family. But the English economy wasn't at its best in the 1620s, thanks to that war we talked about earlier, so saving up enough money was becoming more difficult, which made people want to go to the colonies. The way this worked was that the company would sign a contract with a servant that they would serve a planter for a number of years before they would be granted land and servants themselves, and those servants would have similar contracts. This was an endless scheme colonies ran on in this period. On paper, this works great, but it all hinges on the company being able to deliver on their promised land and servants when the terms are up, or else it all falls apart. As the honeymoon period ended and tensions on the island continued to rise, the failure of the plantation to develop successful crops became apparent. Tobacco was the only crop the settlers had any experience in growing. It was really hard to grow tobacco back then, so when the Bermuda settlers came to Providence first, they began growing what they knew. But the company hated tobacco. They didn't think it belonged in their devout society. They called it things like the scurvy weed. They really hated it. So from the beginning, the company was ordering planters to experiment with other types of crops. But as the hope was drying up moving into the middle of the decade, colonists sent demands to the company. They said they needed to grow cotton and tobacco more, work less on fortifications, be sent their promised servants, and be allowed to trade with Dutch ships that came into the harbor. At this point, the company was fed up with the planters and told them if they spent half the energy they used yelling at each other and complaining, experimenting with crops, they wouldn't have any problems. They even warned the planters that if they weren't grateful for the land God gave them, they might be treated like the ancient Israelites and have their land taken back by God. But the company begrudgingly allowed them to grow more tobacco and cotton, and made a lot of promises they wouldn't fulfill, like sending more servants. The servant thing was especially important because after almost 5 years, a lot of contracts were ending, and those servants needed to get their promised servants when they were done. As we talked about before, if there aren't any servants to keep the cycle going, it all falls apart. In the face of this crisis, the company did what they were avoiding doing, and allowed widespread slavery on the island. Another problem quickly became planters were avoiding English servants and purchasing slaves instead, which quickly made slaves outnumber servants like crazy. Letters from the island mention that an English servant costed about 300 to 500 pounds of tobacco, while you can buy a slave from a Dutch ship for only 150 pounds. Not everyone was on board with this, though. People like Samuel Rishworth thought slavery contradicted their religion and even worked with slaves to organize rebellions and help them escape into the mountainous interior where they could be relatively safe. Fun fact, Providence Island was the site of the first English slave rebellion. But most colonists and the company board barely put any thought into justifying slavery. Planters could make up for not owning land by owning slaves, and the company could save money on servants by purchasing slaves, so no other justification was needed. In just a few years, the devout and humble Providence Island would have more slaves than any other English colony, and later governors would describe colonists venturing into the interior to retrieve slaves as a sport. In 1635, Providence Island would begin its rapid transformation into a center for piracy that would sideline the initial goal of a devout society. This shift became possible when a Spanish fleet arrived outside New Westminster. The fleet sailed against currents and into unfavorable terrain to avoid the island's fortifications, and attacked on the eastern shore of the small land bridge connecting most of the forts to the rest of the island. The colonists were able to drag their cannons up to the cliffs overlooking the bay and fire down on the Spanish who were defeated. This victory meant the company could get the king's approval to conduct legal piracy. This was a really big deal. The colony needed a new governor to lead it through this radically different period, and the company had already blamed a lot of Providence's failures on Governor Bell, so they were happy to replace him with Captain Robert Hunt. Hunt ushered in the new era of military domination of the civilian government, as all important figures after him were captains. So, the book I read for this video opens its chapter on Hunt by saying, quote, "Unfortunately, Robert Hunt was a dismal failure as governor of Providence Island." It's harsh, but it's true. He hurt the colony with basically every decision he made. He basically increased infighting beyond repair, he prosecuted the former governor out of spite, and was even involved in, quote, poisoning business against Bell's servants. In a letter in March 1637, the company described Hunt as chosen by Providence itself, but by 1638 he was replaced with the much more promising, but equally useless, Nathaniel Butler. Captain Butler was a 61-year-old former governor of Bermuda, just like Bell. He seemed like the perfect person to save Providence Island. Unlike Bell, who lived below his means and as a result didn't command respect from the military, Butler was a perfect gentleman soldier in the ideals of the time. He lived in a beautiful Venetian home, he took a personal interest in the repairing of the fortifications, going out in a rowboat to look at them, he entertained hundreds of guests, he spent his mornings hearing complaints from colonists, and he tried to maintain good relations with the civilian council. But at this point in the colony's life, military interests had completely taken over, and no matter how nice Butler was to the civilian government, his primary motivations was ensuring private ships were well taken care of, the militia was well equipped, and fortifications were well kept. In 1640, he just quit and left the island without telling the company, putting Captain Andrew Carter in charge, who was just the absolute worst. He was there for the last year of the island's life, and he acted like a tyrant, even imprisoning people without trial for no reason but to spite the civilian government. A couple months after Carter took power, the Spanish attacked again, and he was a terrible commander. There were reports that he ducked at every shot. Despite his leadership, the settlers fought off the invading force of about 300 soldiers. If we didn't need even more proof that the colony had completely abandoned its godly ideals, Carter executed surrendering soldiers. When the company got news of Carter's war crimes, they fired him and sent for a new governor to come from New England with a couple hundred Puritans. But when they sailed into Providence's harbor later in 1641, they found Spanish flags had already been raised over the island. On May 24, 1641, the citizens of New Westminster woke at dawn to see a massive Spanish armada sailing directly into the harbor. The pirates of Providence Island had made life impossible on the Caribbean coast, to the point that the royal court of Spain had specially ordered this armada. The fleet was so massive that it carried 1,400 soldiers. If you remember, the previous fleet carried only 300. The settlers put up a good fight, but the battle was over quickly. There was really no hope. The Spanish reported that they found almost as many slaves as they found English. Before the Catholic invaders even arrived, the Puritans on the island barely held on to the majority. On the morning of May 25th, a Catholic mass was held in the minister's church, finally ending the Puritan experiment. After the colony was captured, it was turned into a small Spanish fortress to keep it out of Dutch hands. The harbor of the Spanish city of Cartagena saw more trade ships in the 2 months after the invasion than in the previous 2 years. The Puritan pirates really were like a scourge. The company members had already turned their attention to a project on the Mosquito Coast, so this wasn't that big of a loss, and they would later argue before the king for the creation of a West Indies company like the Dutch to keep their interests alive in the region. And they would later become central players in the English Civil War. Providence's first governor, Philip Bell, would go on to lead Barbados through its sugar revolution in the 1640s, which would make it one of England's wealthiest colonies. After the events of this video, Massachusetts Bay would become the model for the future English presence in the region, and Providence Island would fade into obscurity as those involved went on to better things, and everyone slowly forgot about the importance it once held. Well, thanks for watching. I don't know how long that one was. It feels pretty long. My recording is, it's like an hour long, 50 minutes right now. I hope you liked it. I had a lot of fun making it. I really enjoyed the maps. I did some fancy things with the maps. I hope it looked good. I hope future Jake is able to figure out how to do cool stuff with the maps, because I haven't done any of that yet. I just did the initial zoom. But anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching.